You've seen him everywhere. In the window of a Chinese restaurant, on a shelf at the gift shop, sitting on someone's kitchen counter between the coffee maker and the olive oil. The fat, laughing Buddha, belly out, grinning like he knows something you don't. If you've ever wondered why he looks like that, why the founder of one of the world's great spiritual traditions is depicted as this joyful, round, enormously contented figure, why is the Buddha fat? Why is the founder of one of the world's great spiritual traditions that preaches moderation depicted as this joyful, round, enormously contented figure? Now, you might have Googled this. A lot of people have. And Google will tell you something like this. And go try this. It'll say something at the top like, it's a case of mistaken identity. The fat figure isn't actually the Buddha. It's the Budai, a Chinese folk deity. Now, and it'll continue to say that people mix them up over the centuries. Okay, that answer is technically true, but it's also one of the most spectacular oversimplifications in the history of human culture. Because what actually happened and why it happened is one of the most interesting stories that I know of in culture. It is a story about how great ideas survive and spread, about what gets preserved when a philosophy crosses a border, travels 1,000 miles, enters a new language, a new people, a new world, about what has to change so that what matters can stay. Now, once you understand this, once you've really seen the pattern, you will understand something about art that most people rarely think to ask these days. And this will include a lot of what people are talking about in 2026 in relation to the adaptation of the Odyssey by Christopher Nolan. Hi, my name is Kirk Barbera, and I am the founder of Troubadour.studio. I hope you'll go visit it. We have a literary canon club where you can join me live and discuss the great works of the literary canon. I've also done my own translation for first-time readers of Homer's The Iliad. You can get chapter 1 for free, Troubadour.studio/Iliad, and you could buy the product if you like it there. So I'm very interested in the canonical works of Western literature from Homer till today. So we're going to explore more than just why the Buddha is fat. We're going to explore things like, why is there a Korean and a black Jesus? Why do all of these trappings change as they go into new cultures? And what can we learn from this? That's the most important thing. What can we learn from this about what's important and what is not? Now, let's go into a little bit of who the historical Buddha really was. First, I want to apologize that I'm not going to get the pronunciation of all these different cultural names correct. So I apologize. Please go ahead and correct me in the comments. This is meant as no disrespect. I tend to read more than I listen to things, so a lot of times I just have a name pronounced in my head and it's not necessarily correct. Who was the historical Buddha? He was a man who was alive around the 5th century BC in northern India. That's present-day Nepal, Bihar region. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. Now, by every account that we have, he was lean, he was ascetic, he preached moderation and mindfulness. He was not fat, and obviously he looked Indian. He was from that region. He dressed as an Indian ascetic of his time, and his core teachings were the 4 noble truths: the Dukkha, the Samuddaya, the Nirodha, and the Magga. Again, apologies for pronunciation. And basically what this is life involves suffering and dissatisfaction. That's the Dukkha. The Samuddaya is suffering has a cause. It's desire and attachment to things. The Nirodha is that suffering can end, and the Magga, that there is a path to that ending. The 8-fold path: right understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, concentration. So he has a whole framework, a philosophical framework. This video is not about that. I suggest if you're interested in Buddhism, you look that up. The important thing is that these ideas are the substance of Buddhism. Everything else, how the figure looks, what he wears, how fat he is the container of the philosophy. Now, after his death, for roughly 600 years, there were actually no human images of him at all. He was depicted only symbolically, usually through an empty throne, the Budai tree, his footprints, the wheel of Dharma. Now, his absence from the image, that was the point. That was the image that early Buddhist teachers were trying to explain. It pointed towards transcendence. You show an empty throne, say that this is the Buddha because he transcended. That was deliberate. He was considered too significant to be rendered as a man. Now, this changes after Alexander the Great goes into India. Alexander the Great's campaign reached the Gandhara region, which is modern Pakistan, Afghanistan, in 326 BC. After Alexander, Greek and Hellenistic artists were working within that region. So there was an emigration of artists into that region from the Hellenistic world. That's the Greek world. They were the ones who first gave the Buddha a human face. And guess what? It looked Greek. Wavy hair, like classical statuary, idealized features reminiscent of the Belvedere Apollo, flowing robes in the Greco-Roman style. The first Buddha statue looked more like a Greek god than an Indian aesthetic. Now, was this wrong? Was this corruption? I am going to argue no, it was transmission. Greek artists had no visual vocabulary for Indian spiritual philosophy. They used what they had. The idea came through. And to understand this, I'm going to give you a philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers, Aristotle, in his Poetics. In Aristotle's Poetics, written in the 4th century BC, he says, "Poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history, since its statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars." Now, this is an important distinction. History records particulars. This is what you find in a Wikipedia, the dates, the times, the names of people that were involved, who was there. But art shows and reaches for universals, the important fundamental nature of things. So history is, what did the Buddha actually look like? Particular. He was Indian, he was thin, he was 5th century BC. This is something with modern technology they can actually probably recreate using different AI models, using the bones of the people at that time, different depictions. You could probably put together a good rendering of what the historic Buddha might have actually looked like. But art is something different. It gets to, what does Buddhism mean and how do you transfer and transmit those ideas to different cultures? So what does Buddhism offer a soul? What is the universal? That is liberation, path out of suffering, joy, a certain kind of joy. The visual image of the Buddha is not history, it is art. And art does not owe us historical accuracy, it owes us truth. This one principle is the framework for this entire video and a lot of my viewpoint about art versus history. And the framework will also help us understand the adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey in 2026. So let's get into a little bit about how Buddha went from this historic figure that's out there spreading the Four Noble Truths in northern India, and how this then adapts and transmits around the entirety of the world to become one of the great world spiritual traditions. Now, as Buddhism, the philosophy, the religion, traveled the Silk Road into China, the image became progressively more, guess it, Chinese. Features like the hairstyle, the robes, all shifted to look a little more Chinese. In fact, what happened is really interesting. A form of Buddhism merged with Confucian and Taoist ideas. And there was a new kind of synthesis that was still Buddhist at its core. This is the merger that created the Fat Buddha. Now, I want to say something as an aside here. I think it's perfectly legitimate to have arguments about how certain changes might fundamentally alter the universal ideas and the universal truths. That is a legitimate thing. I do not disagree with that. I am arguing against the trappings being fundamentally important. That how he looks, the skin color, the hair color, the clothing, that's all irrelevant. What's relevant are the deep universal truths that he represents. Now, if you want to, again, argue that, oh, well, if you attach Taoist ideas to Buddhism, you're losing this aspect of Buddhism, which is fundamental. I think those kind of things are incredibly important for people interested in ideas. So that I agree with. You should make those arguments. But let's continue our story about the Fat Buddha. So as Buddhism made its way into China, it merged with a figure called the Budai. This is a real person who wandered around the 10th century. He was a Chinese Buddhist monk. He was known for his generosity, his joy, his contentment. He carried a cloth sack full of gifts for the poor. In Chan Buddhism, he came to be identified as a manifestation of Maitreya, or what's called the future Buddha. His image merged with the Buddha figure, not by mistake, but because at that time, Chinese culture associated weight with prosperity, success, and good fortune. Now, the Wharton professor, G. Richard Schell, who's written a lot about influence and cultural transmission, and he's written about cultural values, he has this to say in one of his books called Springboard. Fat Buddha is a legacy of a period of Chinese history that equated weight with success. Budai morphed into Fat Buddha and remains a success symbol that Chinese merchants all over the world place in their stores to attract good fortune. Now, I'm arguing this is not an error. This is strategic alignment with local values. The Four Noble Truths, liberation from suffering, the path of enlightenment, came through the door that Budai opened. So in other words, it would not have otherwise happened if there was not a connection to what was already deeply held cultural beliefs. So Buddhism did not fail in China because it was adapted. It thrived. China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. Buddhism remains one of the dominant spiritual traditions of East Asia precisely because it was willing to let the outer image change while the inner philosophy traversed and traveled. Just to give you another example, in Japan, the Hotai, this is the Japanese name for the Fat Buddha, became one of the 7 lucky gods. Buddhism merged the native Shinto tradition. The two were not seen as contradictory by many. The Japanese developed a certain kind of Shinbutsu, which was, again, a synthesis of kami beliefs and Buddhism. The old religion was not replaced as much as it was integrated and moved into a new form, learning from old truths from a Buddhist Indian instructor. That's how those ideas then spread into new worlds. Both were considered true, and it was this syncretic fusion that is still alive in Japanese culture today. If you truly value ideas, you want them adapted. The adaptation is the mechanism of survival. The Fat Buddha is not a corruption of Buddhism. He is proof that Buddhism won. So now let's move into how Greeks and Greek culture has spread throughout the world and continues to spread. It is a continual process that I am a big advocate of, is getting the Greek, the Roman, and really the Western canonical tradition into all cultures, including in America today, all over the world. And a good example of this was Japanese Oresteia. There was a director, Kuniya Sugihara, who did Kuniya 15, The Greeks in 2019. This was in the Kanagawa Arts Theater, Yokohama. It was a 10-hour trilogy adapted from another production drawn from Homer, and it took Homer, Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles, the 3 great Greek tragedians from the 5th century. The entire cast was Japanese actors. There was a mix of modern dress and kimono, not ancient Greek dress. Helen of Troy sings her lines into a handheld microphone. Electra raps about her tragic destiny. There's new Japanese translations that are colloquial, plain language, contemporary. And the director's stated focus is not whether actors look Greek, but whether they can, quote, communicate with the gods in a quiet voice if you really believe what you're saying. So it's about them in Japan accepting and understanding these deep Greek viewpoints. His goal was for audiences to follow the story and to concentrate on its meanings, the moral responsibility, revenge, longing, honor, and justice in a Greek sense as timeless drama. This is the Greek tradition arriving in Japan and being claimed by Japanese culture, not as a foreign curiosity, but as a living drama. What survived, even though the dress, the hair, the eyes, the facial features, all of that changed, the moral structure of, for instance, the Oresteia by Aeschylus, the chain of revenge, the question of justice, the founding of law, that all stayed. What was adapted was everything else. That's the principle I'm talking about in real action today. What the Fat Buddha teaches us in terms of its cultural historical transmission is that to get the ideas into different cultures, you have to connect it to deeply held cultural values already present in that culture. A second point I want to make that's related, we can learn from Black and Korean Jesus. Now, I want to make a quick side statement here. I am not Christian. I am not Buddhist. These are not my beliefs. I am looking at this as a cultural historian and an aesthetician. That is, an aesthetician. So I'm interested in how these ideas transmit and go into different cultures. And I'm interested in how these artistic representations shift our cultural values and transmit fundamental ideas, right or wrong. So I don't actually agree with all of the fundamental ideas, but I do agree that this is what happened. And I'm trying to portray that. And I want to say I'm trying to be respectful to different belief systems and viewpoints. We could do other videos on my viewpoints down the line. So let's talk about Black Jesus. Now, Black and Korean Jesus. Now, there is a joke from the movie 21 Jump Street, and I think it's very immediately funny. And you've probably, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Jonah Hill goes and Channing Tatum go to the building that's 21 Jump Street, and it's an old Korean Christian church. Inside is a depiction of Christ, but he looks Korean. Now, most of us, even if we're not Christian, we still laugh at this. And it's meant to be a very funny joke. I would be willing to bet that most people in Korea would not understand why that was funny at all. They're like, well, that's what Jesus looked, right? They wouldn't have any clue. But the reason is because we know it as we think that it is a odd depiction because we're not used to it. We're used to a blue-eyed, blonde type Jesus usually. White Jesus is actually a European tradition of painting. Black Jesus is a tradition in African Christianity, and Korean Jesus is a tradition in Korean Christian art. And we kind of accept this without really thinking about it too much, which means, I believe, we intuitively understand the principle. Maybe we just haven't articulated it. So let's do what we did with the Buddhist, with the actual historical Buddha. Now, a lot of people claim there's a historical Jesus. Let's just accept that for here. So historical Jesus was a first century Mediterranean Jew from the Galilee region. He would have looked like the people of that time and place. He would have had darker skin and Semitic features. The Jesus of Raphael and Michelangelo is a product of European artists depicting him in their own image, exactly as Chinese Buddhists depicted the Buddha in their cultural values. Now, the core of Christianity, what Christianity actually is in its essence. I think one of the chief views is that the word of God as revealed through Christ, that love God and love your neighbor as yourself, the salvation of the soul, the kingdom of heaven available to everyone, and the brotherhood of all believers in Christ. The color of Jesus' skin is not on the list. It's not theologically relevant. Now, again, I want to have an aside that people can have a legitimate disagreement with that. If they think that it is a core, that's another argument. I think that's a mistake, though, even though I'm not a Christian. Now, to kind of bring some of this out, let me bring in another literary critic, not Aristotle, another one that I like, which is Horace. Horace wrote Ars Poetica in 19 BC. He was actually trying to, I think, dissuade a couple of rich boys from entering into poetics because he didn't think they had what it takes. But in there, he has a lot of interesting insights into literature and into artistic theory. And here's what he says about adapting Achilles and Homer onto the stage. Remember, Homer wrote in the 800 BC. His story takes place in the 11th century BC. And here's what Horace says. If you bring back to the stage the honored Achilles, let him be tireless, wrathful, inexorable, fierce. Let him claim that laws were not made for him. Let him claim everything by force of arms. Now, Horace's principle and what must be preserved in a character is its soul, its characterological essence, that it has to be, Achilles has to remain the same forever in terms of his inner soul, who he really is as a character. Achilles must be wrathful. Remember from the Iliad, sing to me, muse, of the wrath of Achilles. To Horace, that is not negotiable. His wrath is who he is. What Horace does not say is that Achilles must be Greek. He must be Mycenaean. He must have light skin. He must wear authentic Mycenaean armor. So again, what is essential is the character, the soul, the animating spirit. What is accidental is the surface, the appearance, the historical detail. Remember the quote from Aristotle, the universal versus the singular. That's what we're talking about. The essential is the universal, his wrath, that laws were not made for him, that he's fierce. Those things are the universal truths of his character. The accidental is his hair color. Does he have hair? Can I depict him? His appearance, historical detail. That's irrelevant. Now let's apply this to a missionary. Let's pretend for a second we are a Christian missionary. And your genuine goal is for people to receive the word of God and thus to save their souls. So what do you actually want if that's what you really are interested in? Do you want people to worship a figure that they can never fully identify with, who looks nothing like them? Or do you want the message to enter so deeply into their souls, integrated into all of them, not only what they look like and how they view things, but their deepest cultural aspirations and cultural values, so deeply that they begin to see themselves in the Word of God, that thus they paint, the painters of that culture paint Christ in their own image? That's the fundamental question. The second, I would argue, is the deeper conversion. When they start to see themselves depicted in this story, then you know the word of God has succeeded. The first way that, is he has to have blue eyes, blonde hair, and white skin, and I don't care where you are, that's it. Well, that is asking other people, for instance, people in Africa, to remain strangers to the story. Black Jesus in Africa is not a distortion of Christianity. It is Christianity winning. It is the best metric that your idea is spreading. It means the story has entered a people's soul so deeply that they have claimed it as their own. Now, I've seen ideologues and idealists all over the world, and including ideas that I believe myself. I've seen the proclaimers of this ideology completely misunderstand this point. You want people to adapt and accept your ideas, your views, and explore them for themselves. This is the difference between receiving this didactically and rammed down your throat versus owning it, integrating it into your actual soul and body. A culture that paints Christ in its own image has stopped treating Christianity as imported from outside and starts treating it as something that belongs to them. A believer who cannot see themselves in the figure is always at a distance from the word. They receive it as a subject, not as a brother. And for Christians in particular, the brother of Christ is the language of Christianity. That brotherhood requires identification, but identification of yourself into these universals. The alternative, insisting on one fixed visual image, is not spreading the Christian faith. It is a container being enforced. And in fact, I think what it accomplishes is making slaves, not brothers. because it is the slave who has imposed on him these ideas and says, you will agree with this. And it is the believer, the true integrated believer, who accepts it for himself. And that's what you have to ask yourself of what you want. I'm not going to name another particular religion, but there is a religion that completely bans this entire approach. And that's why the only options they have is the sword and subjugation. That's it. And so these are your two fundamental options. And this is not just about religion. This is about fundamental philosophical ideas as well. My belief is that you want people to accept good ideas and integrate them into their lives on their own, which means you have to reach them where they are. Now, there are all kinds of amazing examples of Homer being translated and adapted in various ways through various cultures. In a previous video, I talked about how an American author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, adapted Greek myths, not just Homer, but Ovid and others, for modern kids at that time, changing much of the clothing and trappings, but keeping the universal underlying principle of what he was trying to convey. I have not seen Nolan's The Odyssey. I'm recording this at the end of May 2026. And what Christopher Nolan has adapted, I don't know yet. I'm waiting to find out and watch the story itself. To me, whether it fails or succeeds will be not about the trappings of the clothes, the ships, even the style of the language, but whether or not they capture the essence and the universal truths, the fundamental ideas of the characters and the story itself. Is this a story about the man who endures, the polytropos, that is the man of many turns, wily, resourceful, surviving by intelligence more than force? Is this the Nostos story rather than the Kleos story? So the Iliad is the Kleos Time story, that is the glory and honor or the war epic. This is not a war epic, so a lot has to change for this to be captured appropriately. This has to do with Nostos, the longing for home, the homecoming story. That's the engine of the poem. Calypso, a goddess, offers Odysseus not only immortality, but agelessness. So she offers him to be essentially a god, to enter the pantheon of the gods. Odysseus turns this offer down because he understands that the human world is superior to the world of the gods, that there is something not good about the world of the gods. He still reveres them, he still worships them, he still respects them as the core of his religion, but he admires and believes that the human and what it means to be a man is the greatest thing in the universe. And that is Homer. That is very Homer. And Homer does the same thing in the Iliad. So that is a very deep value. Odysseus wants to return to his mortal wife, his mortal life, his son, and his island. These are things rife with problems. So instead of staying with an ageless beauty like Calypso, he wants to return to his aging wife because the mortal is superior to the immortal. I want to see if Nolan captures the Greek individualism, personal glory. This is a big part. This is Kleos. This is a big part of Homer, is not just glory for your country. That's Virgil in Rome. Homer is actually interested in individualism and getting stuff and glory for yourself above all others. And in fact, that's what the Iliad is about. Achilles is mad because he doesn't get all the glory that he believes he deserves. So he shrugs. Does Nolan capture reason over brute force? Does he capture things like self-identity under pressure? Does he capture a Greek value that is in Homer of questioning what you know, of questioning your own taboos and values? Does he capture the fundamental theme in the Odyssey of civilization versus savagery? And I would also argue of secular humanism. Again, that's a world where humans are preeminent, that the human is the good. It's not kowtowed, bowing to superior beings, but that there is something beautiful and special about being a human. That's what I hope that he gets across, because if he does, and if he spreads that throughout the world, I think that's a good thing. Now, if he doesn't, if he changes some of those things, then I'll have criticisms. So my point is that when a Japanese director has the Greek Electra rap about her tragic destiny in a kimono, and you still feel the weight of what she is carrying, Homer has won again. This happens over and over and over again throughout all of culture, and my argument, this is a good thing. So the Vishal Bhardwaj trilogy, and I apologize for pronunciation again, Shakespeare going to Bollywood. So the Maqbool in 2003 is Macbeth set in the Mumbai underworld. The Umkara is 2006, is Othello set in rural Uttar Pradesh. The Hader in 2014 is Hamlet set during the 1995 Kashmir insurgency. And it's considered actually one of the great Hamlet adaptations in world cinema. It used the prince's moral crisis to illuminate the actual trauma of the Kashmir. All of this is in Hindu, and it all uses Indian actors, all settings completely contemporary. Shakespeare plot structure and soul remains intact. Just to give you a personal example, I played Bhima or Bhim in the Mahabharata tales. So I sometimes act as an actor. This is with Austin Shakespeare. And I'm an American, born and raised here, third generation. My genetics is something like Jewish, German, Italian, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I played Bhima, one of the 5 Pandava brothers, great heroes of the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is one of the longest narrative poems ever composed, over 200,000 lines. As a contrast, the Odyssey is about 12,000 lines. There was an adaptation by Peter Brook, who compressed it into, I think, an 8 or 10 hour stage play. He then adapted that into a 4-hour movie. We adapted it into a 2-hour or so stage play. So we're adapting it down, because it's too long to do. On stage with me were Indian actors, white actors, black actors, a whole mix. What I was trying to preserve on stage was not Bhima's Indian appearance. It was his soul, his strength, his loyalty, his ferocity, his love for his brothers. If that came through, the adaptation served the work. If it didn't, no amount of authentic costuming could have saved it. And, Hollywood does this kind of thing all the time, bringing all these kinds of stories into American English. Every Russian in a Hollywood film, even in Russia, is somehow speaking a form of American English, right? Most Romans and most Roman movies are having some form of modern American English. That's just the way it is because they're adapting it to a different culture. So to return to the fat Buddha, who traveled from a 5th century Indian forest through a Greek sculptor's workshop, down the Silk Road into a 10th century Chinese village, into a Japanese temple, and onto the wall of every Chinese restaurant in the world. At every step, the surface changed, but what survived? Liberation, joy, the path of suffering, the fire. The standard for any adaptation, not is this historically accurate, but does the essential survive? That's what I hope you will take away from this video and apply to different movie adaptations. Not is this historically accurate, but does the essential survive? And this is true if you see an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, right? Or an adaptation of Anna Karenina, or an adaptation of Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. And I will say that the people most resistant to adaptations are usually those who love the surface of these works most and the ideas least. And I have to say a criticism. It really seems clear to me that many of them have not actually read and studied the works. Because if you have, you would be more enamored and interested in the question of, is Nolan capturing the essence of the story and the essence of Odysseus and the Greek values of that time being transmitted? Not do they use a certain word that you're not interested in or you think is not an appropriate translation. That's not an accurate way. That's a trapping. Shakespeare, Aeschylus, Virgil, Homer, these are not possessions of one ethnicity, but are the common inheritance of human beings willing to receive them. And that's what I think is so important, is for me, as somebody who wants to spread the canonical works of the Western tradition from Homer to Melville and beyond, I'm interested. I don't care what your skin color is, your creed, what background you have, if you're poor, rich, in between, middle, it doesn't matter. I want these ideas to spread around the world to you. And if that means you have to accept it into your soul by enacting it yourself and looking like yourself, go, good. Let's go, baby. My argument is art is not history. When a great idea crosses a border, it sheds its historical skin, the color of the figure, the clothes, the language, and keeps only what is universally true. The fat Buddha, Black Jesus, Electra wrapping in a kimono. These are not corruptions of their traditions. They are proof that those traditions are winning. And that is why the demand for historical accuracy in art isn't just wrong, it mistakes the container for the fire. Thank you. I'll see you next time.